In the summer of 2014, James King was a 21-year-old college student. He was walking between two summer jobs when he encountered who he would later find out were an FBI agent and a police officer who were not in uniform, didn't identify themselves.
I remember being pretty happy that day. I'd gotten out of work early. I was happy with the job that I'd done, and I was calling my sister at the time and somewhat distracted by looking at my phone when two men approached me, stepped toward me off the curb and said, hey, who are you? And I said, I'm James. And they said, oh, really, is that your real name? I was kind of thrown off. I was getting a weird vibe from these guys immediately. And I'm a pretty pro-social person that I would consider myself as such. So I started engaging them, but then one man stepped behind me and I felt very uncomfortable. And they asked me, is that your real name? And I said, yes, that's my real name. And then they were wearing these lanyards, and one of them asked me to step aside, and they sort of had an air of authority, so I started to comply. But one of them stepped behind me, boxed me out, and took my wallet out of my back pocket. And at that point, I realized I was being mugged. So I went to run, to flee, and I was tackled and ultimately beaten pretty severely. After some time in this altercation, and I had been blacked out, and it's hard to recall some of the details, but the police came, and then that was when I realized that they weren't muggers, but they were just acting outside of what they ever should have done in their roles as a police detective and an FBI agent. As I was being physically assaulted, I was screaming for someone to call the police because I was scared out of my mind. I was trying to get away, trying to get out of this situation, trying to survive, really fighting with everything that I could to flee as I was yelling for help and for any bystanders that might be near to call the police. When I was being choked, I feared for my life truly, and it was a moment where everything went black, and as far as I know, that is as close as you can get to being dead without being dead. And I truly, really thought it was over in that moment. I discovered that the men that did this were police when the other police came over and didn't arrest them.
Keep in mind, the crime supposedly committed by the suspect James was mistaken for was so inconsequential, stealing empty soda cans and some liquor from his former boss, it in no way justified the incredibly violent beating James endured at the hands of the police.
The criminal justice system closed its ranks immediately. As soon as uniformed officers arrived on the scene of James's beating and realized that James was not the fugitive, one officer actually went around and caused witnesses who had videotaped or taken pictures of what happened to delete all the evidence that they had. And then James was taken immediately to the hospital where he was handcuffed to his hospital bed before being sent to jail and charged with several felonies for resisting what he didn't even realize was an arrest. So James was innocent, got beaten up, and as a result, the prosecutor charged James with a bunch of crimes rather than anybody apologizing to James for what had happened to him. The prosecutor brought serious felony charges against James, and I'm sure expected that James would have taken the plea deal that was eventually offered. But instead, James fought it out, went to trial, and was acquitted on all charges. That's important because typically prosecutors are able to leverage these sorts of charges against someone to get them to take a plea deal and thereby prevent them from holding the officers who violated their constitutional rights to account.
I went directly from the hospital to the jail cell where I was, stripped of my clothing, given a jumpsuit, given a mugshot. I talked to the nurse, and again, when I was there, even the other inmates, the people serving my food, I remember getting 2 dinners because they felt bad for me and knew that I didn't belong there. When I was arraigned in the jailhouse and the bail was set for $50,000, I remember feeling so defeated and so confused. And the judge who did the arraignment, I understand that they were doing their job and didn't know the situation, but they didn't look me in the eyes or anything. It was just hit the gavel and move on with your day. And I, at that time, had not even talked to my parents. I was alone and scared and did not know what to do. I do not feel that I did anything to spark this event at all. I did nothing wrong. walking on the sidewalk as a normal citizen on a sunny summer day going to my internship. After I was released from jail, much to my surprise, I wasn't given an apology. I was charged. The police officers charged me with 3 violent felonies. I had to go to trial, a jury of my peers, 6 months later, and I spent that whole 6 months probably the most scared and the most stressed I've ever been in my entire life, having no idea if I'm going to spend the next 10 years of my life in prison for something that I didn't do. When I was in trial, I remember my attorneys telling me, most people don't win against the government, and we know that you did nothing wrong, but if they offer you a plea, you should consider taking it. And they did, and I said no. I said, no, I didn't do anything wrong, and I don't deserve to be thrown in jail for something that I was on the wrong side of. That trial was 2 days, 2 very intense days, very stressful. And I remember my family sitting behind me and audibly gasping and crying at the stories that the police officers were making up on the stand as to the supposed terrible things that I had done. And I remember me being on the stand and addressing the questions as best I could and trying to help the jury understand that I was not there because I was a criminal, and that being charged of criminal offenses doesn't mean that you did them. When the jury came back, they unanimously acquitted me of all charges. Myself, my 2 attorneys, Anthony Green and Julia Kelly, jumped up. We all hugged. I cried. My family ran towards me. We all celebrated a lot. I went from extreme state of stress to relief, and it was a lot for my mind to sort of take in at the moment. And I remember as I was walking out of the courtroom, one of the jurors ran up to me and she gave me a hug and she said, "I'm so thankful." She said, "I knew the whole time that you did not belong there, and these men did terrible things to you."
I've known James for years now. I've pretty much been working on this case since its inception. And it's been very difficult, even as a third party, to see the toll that this has taken on James. It's very clearly affected him in his day-to-day life, and it's something that never leaves him.
In the aftermath of this incident happening to me, I had a hard time trusting in general, but especially the system, as I'd always been brought up to believe that the police and the people in authority were the people to go to if you needed help. After being assaulted by them, I was incredibly nervous and still am to this day around police. And I had a 180 of fearing the people, the very people that you should go to if you're in trouble and if you need help. Even in my dating life, you know, as a young man, the internet is used these days a lot to go on first dates, and often they will go well until they Google me and see these weird things about me, and then that's the end of that. Similar experiences with job interviews, or even I have a stable, wonderful employment right now, but I cannot work federal jobs, which is a large part of our business. So these things continually dig into my personal and emotional life all these years later, and that has been an effort that is ongoing to help myself kind of get over this. After I was beaten by these police officers, I never received an apology. I still never have. I don't think they apologized because I don't think that they're sorry for their actions. I don't think they've been taught to have accountability for those types of actions. And they knew, as well as the rest of their department knew, that they would be okay, that they could charge me and possibly get away with it. I would like to hold these officers to account for their misactions, in large part because of the system and how broken it is. These officers did something that was illegal and then charged me for crimes, and the system closed around them and helped them get away with that. There is zero accountability, and I know that this extends beyond the 2 officers that assaulted me. I know that it extends to different departments around the United States. and having that system be reformed from the top down and having our citizens be more aware of their rights and hold each and every officer accountable for their actions would be a great start and a great way for this case to close.
It's important to hold these two officers accountable because they violated the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment prevents the government from undertaking unreasonable searches and seizures. Here, every step of the way, the officers were unreasonable in searching and seizing James, including when they beat him. We filed this lawsuit in 2016. It's now 2020. The government still hasn't even filed an answer addressing all the claims that we've raised. Instead, they've spent the last 4 years filing different motions with courts, arguing under technicalities why they shouldn't be held accountable, rather than explaining why what they did actually wasn't wrong. One of the main ways that the government avoids accountability for violating the Constitution is through a doctrine that's called qualified immunity. And through that doctrine, the Supreme Court created a standard where a police officer or any government official can violate your constitutional rights, and you can do nothing about it unless you can prove that the right was clearly established. Qualified immunity is a doctrine that the United States Supreme Court created in 1982. And it says that a government actor is allowed to violate your constitutional rights. You can't do anything about it unless a court has already decided that the actor's specific actions are in fact a constitutional violation. And what that means is that courts have gotten more and more specific in distinguishing between cases. For example, there's a case this year from the Sixth Circuit where police officers allowed their dog to bite a suspect who had given up. And the suspect pointed to a case where the officers had allowed their dog to bite a suspect who'd given up and said, "This case is clearly established. This is a violation of my rights." The Sixth Circuit said, "Well, actually it isn't, because in that case, the suspect was laying on the ground when he gave up, and in your case, you were just sitting on the ground with your hands up. So the officer couldn't have known that that was a constitutional violation." When a plaintiff seeks to hold a government officer liable or accountable for constitutional violations, they usually use one of two tools. The first is called Section 1983. That's a statute that Congress created in the 19th century, and essentially it says that you're allowed to bring a lawsuit against someone who violates your constitutional rights under color of state law. The second is called Bivens, and that is a case that the Supreme Court decided and essentially adopted the similar standard for actions taken under color of federal law. So in this case, what we have is a situation where two officers were seeking to enforce a Michigan warrant for a Michigan crime against a Michigan resident committed in the state of Michigan and at the request of a Michigan police chief. But those officers have both sought to avoid accountability in this case by saying, notwithstanding all of the Michigan aspects of what we were doing, we were actually not acting under color of Michigan law, but under color of federal law. And because of that, they have been able to create all sorts of havoc in this case to avoid any accountability for what they did.
We've seen an explosion in the use of state and federal joint task forces nationwide in recent decades. They now operate in all 50 states. To take just one example of how rapidly these task forces have expanded, the FBI and NYPD formed their first terrorism joint task force in 1979. By 2001, there were 35. Today, there are about 200, involving officers from more than 650 different state and federal agencies. In an unusual turn of events, both James and the police officers are taking James' case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Here's why. Police and prosecutors are asking the Supreme Court to overturn James's victory and immunize the officers against all of James' claims. James won his case before the Federal Appeals Court in every way but one. The appeals court ruled that the officers acted under federal law, and so they could not be held to account for violating state authority under Section 1983. Unless the Supreme Court steps in, James can only pursue the officers for violating their federal authority under Bivens, but they could not be held to account under state law. James is asking to have the appeals court ruling corrected so that he and other people who have their rights violated by task force members can hold officers accountable under both state and federal law. James and IJ want to end the shell game police and prosecutors have been playing in these kind of cases, where they say, we can't be sued under state law because we were acting under federal law, while at the same time saying, we can't be sued under federal law because we were acting under state law. The government wants to maintain a system where it's heads they win, tails you lose. That's unfair and it's unlawful. James's case is part of IJ's new project on immunity and accountability. Immunity doctrines turn fundamental concepts of American jurisprudence on their head. If citizens must follow the law, the government must also, and that includes following the Constitution. And following the Constitution means officials being held accountable for violating it. The Institute for Justice represents James to ensure that law enforcement officers can't operate above the law and free from the Constitution they were sworn to uphold. A victory for James will set an important precedent through which members of all state and federal joint task forces will be held to account for their actions.